Okay, just before I started, I wanted to go over my thoughts on the class and my reasons for wanting to cover symbolic interactionism as my final project. So overall, I would like to say that this class was very interesting. It was actually nothing like I thought it was going to be. I learned about a lot about how we communicate to each other, the importance of communicating with each other, and how complex communication can be. Um, and I also learned how important learning about communication can be to humanity and just and help with a lot of social issues that we deal with every day. Um, I enjoy learning about all the communication theories. I thought they were all very important to learn about. However, I wanted to choose symbolic interactionism as my final project because I feel like I could have kind of related to it at points in my life, and I thought that what I learned about symbolic interactionism would have been important to learn at points in my life. I am 25 years old now, and I like to say that I feel like I'm pretty much out of that young adolescence age, but I'm still pretty young. Um, and I think that the teachings of symbolic interactionism can help like young people dealing with like, just like understanding themselves and understanding the world around them and their self-esteem. So I kind of just wanted to cover it and go into more detail about this theory for that reason. With that being said, I will go to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide is my definition. I'll first go over the textbook definition of symbolic interactionism, and then I'll define it myself. So the first definition is the textbook's definition. The textbook definition is the ongoing use of language, gestures, in application of how others will react a conversation. I like to define it as that it is like the definitions of what the world gives something and our reaction to those definitions. For instance, when we think about, I think a lot of us probably hopefully haven't been bitten by a rattlesnake. But however, we know that it's poisonous. We know if we hear a rattle and a snake, we're not going to go near it because we're like, that's poisonous. It's a poisonous animal. So how do we know that that animal is poisonous? We know that it's poisonous because our interaction with other people, our communication with other people. So our communication with other people gives definition to situations in our lives, other people, animals, anything really. And I think it's also important to note that this theory leans more to interpretive communication, which that basically means that it can have multiple meanings. So, like it can have multiple meanings and multiple truths. So it's not just really straightforward what the meaning could be. It could be interpreted by different people and have different meanings. So the next slide that we're going to go over is history. So I made this into different parts. I did the why, the when, the who, and the what. So we'll go over the why. So why was the theory created? And the theory was created pretty much like most of the communication theories, was just to understand human communication, why we communicate, how we communicate, and how we can improve our communication. When was it created? It was created by George Herbert Mead, and that's what it was in the textbook too. But a lot of these ideas of symbolic interactionism can go back to some philosophies, and it really started off in the 1800s or the 1850s, and people really revisited it in the 1930s. So anywhere between the 1850s and the 1930s was really the time when this theory was really being, discussed and um, researched. So who? So the person who created or is coined to be the creator of this theory is George Herbert Mead. He was a social constructionist, and he believed that our thoughts and self-concept are wider, and the wider community we live in are created through communication, or symbolic interactionism. So he really kind of just like, he was a researcher, so he kind of just dedicated a lot of his time and energy and career basically in understanding symbolic interactionism. And this is really going into detail about symbolic interactionism was really what his work was about, and the what. So I have, what other theories does this theory relate to, and what other common threads of this theory is connected with society? So this theory can be related to, I believe it can be related to expectancy theory, because the definitions that we give each other and the definitions we give of a situation or anything else is kind of an expectancy, right? Like we expect something to happen. We expect things from people. Those definitions of like, I expect my friend to be trustworthy because you're my friend. That's what my definition of a friend is. We put weight on things. So I think it can relate to expectancy theory for those reasons. And social penetration theory, I think that our interactions with other people give definitions of other people and definitions to like relationships. Say if you had gone through a bad relationship, you might have more social penetration going into a relationship than you were the first time. So I think it relates to social penetration theory in that way. Next, we're going to go into examples. I came up with 3 examples. I gave stereotypes, first impression, and identifying your true self. So, stereotypes, I think that this could be tests that this theory is kind of legitimate, is stereotypes. We don't really, the whole thing of stereotypes comes from our interactions with people. It comes from our definitions of things. We stereotype, perhaps a negative stereotype is pit bulls, dogs, are aggressive and mean and dangerous. That stereotype is a narrative that was written by people. And so I think that sometimes we can also say some stereotypes, but I think we can all think of like 1 or 2 stereotypes that are ridiculous and that they're not true, and that we can prove that definitions and our interactions with things give definition to things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're true. It's just that when people communicate about things, it gives definition to things and it makes people have association to certain things. My next one is first impressions. I think most people have had at least one experience where they have had a bad first impression about another person, or have given off a bad first impression. I have an example of this. I actually work part-time at retail while I'm in college, and a lot of my friends in retail actually told me, they're like, oh, I thought you were so much meaner when you started working here. But I didn't give necessarily any narrative. I wasn't mean or anything like that. I just, I guess, appeared to be mean. So a lot of people, give definitions or label people, but usually they're wrong. So I think an example of this is that not necessarily that these definitions are proven wrong, but that people have written narratives about situations, about people. They give they give like first impressions, first criticize people, or they love people, but they only give through the looking glass, basically. And the next one actually kind of, when it goes along with what I was talking about in the first when I first did the introduction, was identify your true self. So I remember reading about this theory, and they talked about defining the me from the I, and that there is a perception of yourself that other people give you, whether it's your social class, whether it's your race, whether it's your gender, whatever it may be. They identify you and define you as a certain type of person, but who you identify, or who you end up being, who yourself, is different. So there's two different types of people: the person that other people have given you, and the person that you identify or know as yourself is true. And I think when I was talking about how I feel like this relates to confidence, is that example. When you can separate what other people define you as, whether it's people have told you that you're not good enough, or you're not smart enough, or whatever it be, whatever the definitions that other society, people, anything give you, you can separate them and identify what you think of yourself, what you define yourself as. The next one I will go through is compare. So I have two strengths, which is it explains the need of acceptance, and it explains the miscommunication. One weakness is it's hard to not listen to what the world is telling you about yourself. So this theory kind of gives us an insight on human behavior. It gives us an insight of like understanding or wanting acceptance, wanting to have good definitions of yourself. And it also talks about how there can be miscommunications, like prejudice or stereotypes. And weakness, the weaknesses is that it's hard not to listen to those definitions that the world society gives you, and just kind of come up with your own narrative of who you define yourself as. And the next one will be to criticize. Is this theory useful? I would say yes, this theory is very useful. I thought it was personally useful, maybe not so much at this point of my life, but I feel like it would be really important to have young people understand this theory, and understand that the differences in what definitions the world kind of gives you. Do I think it's outdated? No, I think it still stands up today. And is it easy to understand? I think it can be easy to understand, but I can see how also it can be difficult to understand if you don't think that the world, if you don't see that the world's definitions of things. I think maybe some analogies like the one I did with the rattlesnake is kind of makes it a little bit easier to understand. With that being said, these are my sources, and thank you for listening to my speech.